All right, diving into something pretty fascinating today. And knowing your interests, this one's going to be right up your alley. We're looking at feminist philosophy of biology.
Yeah, it's quite a landscape.
Definitely. And think of this as a concentrated deep dive. Yeah, using that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry as our guide.
Excellent resource.
It is, it is. The goal here is to give you, the listener, a solid grasp of the core ideas.
Without getting bogged down.
Exactly, without getting bogged down, yeah. Now you've shown a real interest in, well, unpacking these complex philosophical concepts, right? And this area, feminist philosophy of biology, it's ripe for that.
It really is. And we'll be extracting the core arguments, the real insights from that entry with a particularly philosophical lens in mind, of course.
Of course. Now, for someone who's already, pretty deep into philosophy, why should this particular intersection, feminism and biology, why should it grab your attention?
Well, I think it offers a really powerful case study in how a philosophical inquiry can illuminate the assumptions, the underlying assumptions, even in fields that, strive for objectivity, like science.
Like science, yeah.
It pushes us to consider how deeply ingrained societal values, and particularly those around gender, how those shape our understanding of the biological world.
Right. And the scope of this field is really impressive. As our source material lays out, we're going to be examining these fundamental definitions, right? Sex and gender. What do they actually mean in this context?
Yeah, crucial.
What are the motivations driving these feminist philosophers of biology? What are their critiques of, ideas like biological determinism, essentialism, big ones. And then we'll look at their analyses of specific, areas within biology like sexual selection, sociobiology.
Lots to unpack.
Lots to unpack. Our aim here is to provide you, as a philosopher, a really clear, insightful overview of this vital area, and also its implications for both, philosophy of science and just broader philosophical debates.
Absolutely.
So to get started, maybe a very basic question, but what exactly is feminist philosophy of biology?
Right. Well, at its core, it's the application of feminist theory, particularly feminist philosophy of science, to the life sciences.
Okay.
And what makes it, I think, so fascinating, particularly for a philosopher, is its inherent interdisciplinarity.
Okay.
This isn't just theoretical musings in a vacuum. It actively engages with scientific concepts, methodologies, findings.
So it's philosophy actively grappling with the real world, the empirical world.
Absolutely. And as the entry points out, there are two primary ways that this engagement, manifests. So first, feminist philosophers, they rigorously analyze foundational concepts within biology.
Okay.
So things like the gene, natural selection, even this concept of biological individuality, and they do this using, established philosophical methods.
Okay, so applying the tools of philosophy to these biological building blocks.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And second, they leverage these biological case studies, right, to examine broader and often very enduring questions in philosophy of science.
Okay.
Things like the nature of reductionism, the role of values in science, even, the very definition of objectivity.
It's fascinating. It's almost like using biology as this testing ground for theories of knowledge.
Exactly. And a significant amount of this work is grounded in this naturalistic approach, meaning that it pays really close attention to the actual historical and contemporary practices of biological science.
Right.
So you see, feminist philosophers and, philosophers of biology more broadly, they're increasingly involved in or collaborating on actual biological research.
So it's not just thinking about it from afar. It's getting your hands dirty, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it underscores the deeply interdisciplinary nature of this field. Mm. And for a philosopher who's, maybe considering those boundaries of their own work, it's worth noting that the lines between feminist philosophy of biology and, related areas like science studies,
yeah,
and even the critiques offered by progressive biologists themselves, right?
Yeah.
So think of folks like Lebantin or Gold. These lines can often blur.
Okay, so there's a real crossover, a real intellectual kind of mixing pot happening here.
Precisely. Their concerns, their analyses, they frequently resonate with core feminist insights.
Okay.
And importantly, I think, the entry highlights this. Many of those core critiques originating from feminist philosophy of biology, they're increasingly being recognized and even integrated into mainstream philosophy of biology.
Okay.
And this growing acceptance, I think, speaks to the rigor and the persuasive power of these philosophical insights.
Yeah, it's gaining legitimacy. It's being taken seriously.
Absolutely.
Now, a term that comes up quite frequently in philosophical discussions of this area, of course, is this distinction between sex and gender.
Yeah, big one.
What are the specific philosophical underpinnings of these definitions within feminist philosophy of biology?
Right. So this is foundational. And the entry adopts, these really nuanced definitions developed by Sari Van Anders, who's a feminist neuroendocrinologist.
Okay.
And I think her framework is particularly valuable for philosophical analysis because it aims for both conceptual clarity and real-world accuracy.
Okay.
Moving beyond these simplistic binaries that often obscure more than they reveal.
Right. So getting into the nuances, the complexities. Okay, so how does Van Anders break down these concepts?
Right. So she distinguishes between sex, gender, and then a combined category, gender-sex.
Okay.
So for sex, she's broadly referring to, biological bodily features that have evolved in relation to reproductive roles.
Okay.
However, and this is crucial, I think, for a philosopher, accustomed to binary distinctions.
Right.
She emphasizes that biological sex is not a strict binary. There's significant variation, within individuals, between individuals. And this variation, it includes trans people, even as, male and female serve as those initial reference points related to gamete production.
Right. So it's acknowledging that there's a spectrum. It's not this either.
Exactly. Yeah.
So biological variability is inherent in the definition rather than being treated as this exception or an anomaly.
Right. Right. It's a subtle, but it's a really important philosophical shift.
Absolutely. So then what about gender then?
Okay. So gender in Van Anders's framework encompasses these socialized, learned, cultural aspects of masculinity, femininity, and this broader spectrum, again, of gender diversity.
Okay.
It's about how individuals understand and express their gender within that specific social and cultural context.
Right. So the realm of social constructs and norms.
Exactly.
And then you have this third category, gender sex.
Right. So gender sex it's really designed to capture this complexity of whole person's identities.
Okay.
Or specific aspects of an individual that can't be neatly categorized as solely sex or solely gender.
Okay. So it's acknowledging that there's this interplay, this constant back and forth.
Right. It acknowledges the interplay between our biology, our social experiences, our lived identities. Think about aspects of self-understanding or social presentation that draw from both, right? Yeah. Both biological realities and social meanings in ways that are difficult to disentangle.
Okay.
And as the entry points out, the applicability of gender and gender sex to non-human animals, that remains a topic of debate.
Yeah.
Some scholars like Meynell and Lopez, they make a philosophical case for their extension.
Okay, so applying those concepts beyond just the human realm.
Exactly, which raises, some really interesting questions about anthropomorphism.
Right.
And the nature of social behavior across species.
Yeah, a whole other can of worms, so to speak. But sticking with humans for now, how does this nuanced understanding of sex and gender, how does it inform feminist philosophical analysis of biology?
Right. So having these more sophisticated and empirically grounded accounts of sexual diversity, it provides feminist philosophers with these powerful analytical tools.
Okay.
So they can use these definitions as a kind of control. And think of that in a philosophical sense.
Right, a conceptual control.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
To critically examine existing biological knowledge claims, scientific methodologies, even the very questions that biologists choose to investigate.
Okay.
Right. The aim here is to identify instances where those traditional and often overly simplistic or politically charged gender ideologies, where those might be unduly influencing scientific understanding.
Right. So making sure that those pre-existing biases aren't coloring the research. So it's holding these biological claims up against this more rigorous, more nuanced understanding of the phenomena they're trying to describe.
Exactly. And this includes scrutinizing for, sexism, right?
Yeah.
The devaluation and discrimination based on gender stereotypes.
Right.
And also androcentrism.
Okay.
That male-centered perspective that can lead to the neglect or misrepresentation of female or non-male experiences and biology.
Okay, yeah.
It also involves questioning, this imposition of a rigid sex binary when biological evidence suggests a spectrum, and examining the ways in which those who don't fit neatly into that binary, how they're often marginalized or even pathologized in scientific discourse.
Right. So really looking at how those categories are constructed and who they benefit, who they harm.
Exactly.
This then leads directly into, these core motivations behind feminist philosophy of biology. What are the central philosophical aims driving this field of inquiry?
Right. So the entry highlights several key, I think, interconnected motivations that should really resonate with a philosopher, right? Who's concerned with truth, justice, the responsible application of knowledge.
Okay.
And these include, challenging those biological arguments that have historically been used to justify social inequalities, particularly the oppression of women.
Right.
Also, correcting essentialist approaches within biology that fail to account for, this genuine diversity, within biological categories, especially sex and gender.
Okay.
And then ultimately promoting the development of, more accurate, ethical, and socially responsible accounts of female biology and gender topics in life sciences.
Right. So it's not just about critique. It's also about building, better, more inclusive understanding.
Absolutely.
So let's explore that first motivation a bit further, challenging these biological arguments for oppression. Philosophers are often really concerned with identifying flawed reasoning. What are some examples of how biology has been used to support oppressive social structures, and what philosophical tools are feminists bringing to bear on these arguments?
Right. Well, the entry provides some pretty compelling historical examples.
Okay.
So consider, Edward H. Clarke's 19th century argument against women's higher education.
Okay.
It was based on this, this supposed biological conflict between intellectual development and reproductive capacity.
Right. So the idea that if women developed their minds too much, their bodies would suffer.
Exactly. And this argument, while, easily recognizable as sexist today,
right,
it drew on these prevailing biological ideas to restrict women's access to education.
Right.
A very clear example of how, these biological claims can be used to reinforce those social hierarchies.
It really highlights the need for that critical scrutiny of the underlying assumptions,
Yeah.
Are these claims actually based on solid evidence?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And as the entry notes, this isn't just an isolated incident.
Yeah.
The history of Western thought, it's full of these attempts to justify women's subordination based on, these purported biological differences.
Right.
Tracing all the way back to, the pronouncements of Aristotle.
Right. Yeah, a long, unfortunate history.
Yeah, and feminist philosophers of biology, they've directly confronted these arguments.
Right.
Right. Dissecting the logical flaws, questioning the empirical basis, and really revealing these underlying social and political agendas.
So it's about exposing the non-scientific motivations that are often driving these claims.
Exactly.
And this isn't just a historical concern, right?
No.
These kinds of arguments, they resurface in contemporary debates as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The entry points to some more recent examples, like evolutionary arguments that have attempted to naturalize oppressive practices, things like, violence against women.
Okay.
And these arguments, which often rely on, speculative accounts of human evolutionary history,
right,
they faced rigorous feminist critique for their methodological weaknesses and their potential to excuse, really harmful behaviors.
Right. So just because something might have been adaptive in a certain evolutionary context doesn't mean it's morally justifiable today.
Exactly. Yeah. And similarly, arguments invoking purported biological differences in intelligence between men and women.
Right.
Those have been used to explain disparities in, professional achievement.
Right. The classic women are just naturally less suited for leadership argument.
Exactly. And you see this, in controversial remarks by figures like Lawrence Summers.
Right.
And feminist philosophers have responded by exposing the flawed science, the problematic assumptions underlying those claims.
So it's about demonstrating how these arguments often conflate correlation with causation. They essentialize these complex traits, and ultimately they serve to legitimize these existing power imbalances.
Right. They're trying to give this biological veneer to social injustice.
Exactly. And the entry emphasizes that these oppressive arguments, they frequently rely on these problematic conceptual frameworks, particularly around ideas of dimorphism, essentialism, and determinism.
Right. Core concepts, really, that are themselves ripe for philosophical analysis.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. Dimorphism, this assumption that there are two fundamentally distinct sexes. What's the philosophical critique there?
Right. Well, the critique centers on how these arguments tend to assume this, this strict binary division between male and female, often ignoring or marginalizing, the very existence of intersex conditions,
right,
which demonstrate a much broader spectrum of biological sex characteristics.
Right.
Philosophically, this raises questions about, the nature of categories, how we treat outliers,
right,
the potential for, these social categories to distort our perception of biological reality.
Right. Are we imposing these categories on the world, or are they actually reflecting the world as it is?
Exactly. And, further, these arguments often collapse those socially constructed gender traits into supposedly biologically determined sex traits. So, attributing differences in, toy preference solely to biology.
Right, the classic nature versus nurture debate.
Exactly. Rather than, considering the influence of socialization, the role of culture.
So it's about teasing apart those influences. What's actually biology, what's actually social construction.
Right, exactly.
And then underlying all of this, there's often this implication, isn't there?
Yeah.
That if something is biological, it's somehow fixed, it's immutable.
Right. That's the core of the problem.
Right.
The idea that if social inequalities are rooted in this, supposedly fixed biology, then attempts to challenge or to change them are futile or even, unnatural. This deterministic view, often coupled with, these essentialist notions of inherent male and female natures, it's historically been used to resist efforts towards greater gender equality. And while these ideas may have been more prevalent in, earlier scientific and philosophical discourse, they continue to surface in some contemporary work, particularly, within certain interpretations of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology.
Right. So it's this idea that, well, this is just the way things are, so why bother trying to change them?
Exactly.
Which is a very, very dangerous idea.
It is. It is.
Okay, this leads then to that second key motivation, right?
Right.
Getting the biology right. It's not just about challenging injustice. It's also about ensuring scientific accuracy.
Absolutely. Many feminist philosophers of biology, they have a strong background in science.
Yeah.
They're deeply committed to improving the rigor and accuracy of biological research, especially as it pertains to sex, gender, and their complex interplay.
Right.
And the entry provides this, this compelling example with Anna Arroway's analysis of primate research in her book, Primate Visions.
Okay.
And she illustrates how the increased participation of feminist women in primatology, how that led to significant advancements in methodology.
Okay.
And ultimately a more accurate understanding of primate social behavior.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit? What specific methodological shifts occurred?
Right. So Haraway highlights this transformative impact of feminist primatologists like Jean Altman, whose development of focal animal sampling provided this much more systematic and less anthropocentric way of observing primate behavior. This method, contrasts with earlier, often male-biased approaches. It allowed for this more comprehensive understanding of the social lives of female primates, including their complex social hierarchies, their maternal behaviors, and their interactions with males. Altman's work, it demonstrated how a shift in perspective, informed by feminist sensibilities, but also, rigorous scientific methodology, how that could lead to this more accurate and nuanced picture of primate societies. It's a clear case of how feminist inquiry can contribute to better science.
So it's not about imposing this political agenda on science. It's recognizing how pre-existing and often unacknowledged social and political assumptions, how those can already be shaping scientific inquiry.
Right.
And then using a feminist lens to strive for greater objectivity.
Exactly, and I think that's a crucial insight for a philosopher of science.
Absolutely. This brings us then to the different epistemological perspectives within feminist philosophy of biology.
Right.
The various ways that feminist thinkers are approaching this question of, how we know what we know in the biological sciences and how values intersect with this process.
Yeah, the nature of knowledge itself.
So the entry mentions revealing bias as one key epistemological approach.
Right.
How does that work, and what are its philosophical underpinnings?
So a significant body of early work in feminist philosophy of biology focused on, identifying and challenging those sexist and androcentric biases that were seen to distort biological accounts of sex and gender.
Okay.
So think back to some of the examples that we've discussed.
Right.
Assumptions of female passivity in processes like sex determination and fertilization. The historical focus on male agency in those evolutionary narratives, the androcentric biases in early primatology that overlooked the social lives and behaviors of female primates. The underlying philosophical idea here is that by critically examining those assumptions, the methodologies, the interpretations, within biological research, we can expose and potentially eliminate these biases.
Okay.
And that leads to more accurate and objective knowledge. The feminist perspective, in this sense, acts as this crucial, critical lens.
Okay, so it's shining a light on these hidden assumptions and seeing how they're actually affecting the outcomes of the research.
Right, exactly.
The entry even provides a specific example of this with the critique of sex determination models.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so the biology and gender study group's analysis of, early models of sex determination is a prime example. They pointed out how these models often implicitly assumed this passive role for female development, requiring this active switch for maleness.
Right.
And feminist-influenced work by researchers like Eicher and Washburn in the 1980s, they challenged this assumption.
Okay.
They offer a model based on genetic evidence that didn't rely on these sexist presuppositions.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, they highlighted this, this understudied area of ovary determination.
Yeah.
This demonstrates how a critical examination of those underlying gender biases can lead to new research directions and a more accurate understanding of biological processes.
Right. So highlighting the areas that had been neglected because of these pre-existing biases.
Exactly.
This resonates with Sandra Harding's notion of spontaneous feminist empiricism, doesn't it?
It does.
The idea that by adhering more rigorously to the empirical standards of science,
right,
and being attentive to potential biases, particularly gender bias,
yeah,
you can actually improve scientific knowledge according to its own criteria.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
But as the entry also notes, many feminist philosophers, they argue that simply focusing on the removal of bias, while important, it offers this incomplete picture of the relationship between values and scientific knowledge.
Okay.
It doesn't fully address how values can also play this constitutive role in shaping the very questions we ask.
Okay.
And the frameworks we use to understand the world.
Yeah.
And this leads to that second, more nuanced epistemological perspective, understanding science as a social, value-laden practice.
And this is where Helen Longino's influential work comes into play.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So Longino, she developed this concept of critical contextual empiricism.
Okay.
And her central argument, which has significant implications for philosophy of science, is that there's always this inferential gap between scientific theories and the available empirical evidence.
Okay, so there's always this leap of faith, so to speak.
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
So to bridge that gap, researchers inevitably rely on background assumptions.
Okay.
And these assumptions can include social values, including, gendered ones, whether it's consciously or unconsciously.
Right. So our social and cultural context inevitably shapes how we interpret scientific data.
Precisely. And Longino, she argues that greater objectivity and justification in science, those are achieved not through the elimination of all values, which she sees as impossible.
Okay.
But through the fostering of these diverse scientific communities.
Okay.
Where different background assumptions can be critically examined and debated.
Right. So having a plurality of viewpoints.
Exactly. And when a scientific community includes, individuals with a range of perspectives, and when dissent is taken seriously, the underlying assumptions of research, they're more likely to be brought to light.
Okay.
And evaluated for their plausibility and their consistency with the evidence and broader epistemic goals.
Right. So having that rigorous debate.
Yeah.
Making sure that those assumptions are being challenged.
Right. And she uses examples from various fields, including the study of human sex differences, to illustrate how gendered assumptions have, shaped scientific understanding.
Right. And it sounds like she's arguing for this social epistemology of science.
Yeah.
Where objectivity is a property of the community and its critical practices rather than solely of individual researchers.
That's a key element of her argument. And the entry points out that this recognition of the role of these non-epistemic values in science it's increasingly gaining traction among non-feminist philosophers of biology as well.
So this is becoming more widely accepted.
It is.
This idea that science is not purely objective.
Right. It marks a departure from that traditional ideal of this, completely value-neutral science.
Right. And it has real implications for how we think about science and its role in society.
Absolutely. And this perspective raises these really crucial ethical and political questions, right? About whose interests science serves, how scientific inquiry might be, structured differently in more just social arrangements.
Right.
The entry cites examples like Alison Wiley's work with indigenous communities and research on the HPV vaccine to illustrate these points.
Right. So really bringing in these social and political dimensions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about revealing bias. We've talked about science as this social, value-laden practice. And then we have Donna Haraway's concept of situated knowledge.
Right.
How does that contribute to this epistemological landscape?
Yeah, so Haraway's concept of situated knowledge takes this understanding of the knower's positionality even further.
Okay.
She argues that all knowledge is partial.
Okay.
And it's produced from a specific perspective shaped by, our social, cultural, and material locations, our gender, our race, our class, our embodiment.
Okay.
There is no objective God's eye view.
Right.
Or this completely detached observer.
So the very questions that we ask, the theoretical frameworks we employ, those are all influenced by who we are and where we stand in the world.
Exactly. And Haraway, she emphasizes that the knowing subject is always, culturally and materially situated.
Okay.
Leading to perspectives that are inevitably shaped by our interests and our preferences. However, she also stresses that non-feminist perspectives are equally situated.
Okay.
They just often fail to acknowledge their own particularity.
Right. They claim this false objectivity.
Exactly.
The entry mentions Kathleen Okrulik's really powerful argument about how sexism can permeate the very content of science.
Yeah.
If all the available hypotheses within a patriarchal society are themselves sexist.
Right.
And that's a really profound challenge to traditional notions of scientific objectivity.
It is. It suggests that even rigorous adherence to, methodological norms might not be sufficient to eliminate bias if the entire landscape of available theoretical possibilities is already skewed by those underlying social assumptions.
Right. So you can be following all the rules, but if the rules themselves are biased,
right,
then the results are going to be biased as well.
Exactly. And, in contrast to traditional views that see partiality as this limitation to be overcome, feminist perspectives on situated knowledge,
right,
they see it as this, this inherent aspect of knowledge production that can actually be productive when acknowledged and critically engaged with.
Okay.
So the entry gives those examples of, Jean Altman's innovative methodologies arising from her feminist perspective.
Okay.
And Adrienne Zillman's focus on the diversity of sexual dimorphism, which challenged those male-centered interpretations of human evolution.
So using that situated knowledge to actually advance our understanding rather than seeing it as a limitation. And this appreciation of situatedness, it leads to what the entry calls epistemic pluralism within feminist philosophy of biology.
Right. So given that knowledge is always situated.
Okay.
And biological phenomena are complex. They're multifaceted.
Okay.
It follows that there might be multiple valid explanations for the same phenomena.
Okay.
Arising from, different contexts and perspectives.
Right. So there's not necessarily this one right answer.
Right. Feminist philosophers of biology, they tend to be more open to considering a range of well-supported explanations, recognizing that this plurality can enrich our understanding of these complex biological systems.
Okay.
Rather than, simply indicating this lack of definitive knowledge.
Right. So embracing the complexity.
Right. The critique of the man-the-hunter theory of human evolution.
Okay. Which
focused on this single causal factor and neglected other important aspects, like gathering the role of language in culture. That's a good example of this, this pluralistic approach.
Yep. Right. So looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay. So this has provided, a really comprehensive overview, I think, of those conceptual foundations, the epistemological frameworks.
Yeah.
Now let's turn to how these insights are applied to specific conceptual themes within biology.
Right.
Starting with, these interconnected ideas of determinism, reductionism, and essentialism. These are concepts that are, frequently debated in philosophy of science.
Absolutely. And the entry highlights how these conceptually distinct ideas, they often work in tandem, right?
Okay.
Within biological research that draws feminist critique. So determinism, in this context, it refers to the tendency to attribute, a particular outcome solely or primarily to a single factor or a limited set of factors.
Okay.
This often links with essentialism.
Okay.
Where that determining factor is seen as fundamental and inherent to the organism, defining its essential nature, even if, the supposed effect is not always manifest. And reductionism here describes the approach of focusing primarily on these internal, often you,